So this is the Sabhasava Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 2. Just a few sections that I want to speak about. In the first section, the basic summary of it, it says, Bhikkhus, I say that the destruction of the taints is for one who knows and sees, not for one who does not know and see. And who knows and sees what? And it says, it's translated as wise attention and unwise attention. So he knows the difference there.
He knows, okay.
So, and that wise attention is Yoniso Manasikara. And for now, I will translate that as an attention with perspective. So who knows and sees what?
You could probably say, because it's Yoniso of Manasikara, Yoniso Manasikara. So you could say perspective of attention.
So you know perspective of attention and non-perspective of attention.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not the attention necessarily that it's different. It's whether you have perspective on your attention, you don't have perspective. Whether you're aware, as we say, peripherally regarding what you're attending in front of you, or you're not aware peripherally regarding what you're attending in front of you. Because that's by definition that's what perspective is. Having perspective means not being absorbed in like one narrow, one pointed thing, but actually having perspective on it, not losing the context of that thing, of that situation. And you see why that's necessary, because often in the suttas we would give those similes of the trap, the poison drink, all that, and all those things can only be known if you gain perspective in regard to it, because nothing you attend in the trap will reveal the trap as a trap. That's why it's a trap. But if you know, if you have perspective that it's a trap, then you will basically not engage with it. If you have perspective that it contains poison that you cannot detect, but you know, so there is perspective in regard to attending to this poisonous drink, and you will not drink it. That's why Buddha said there is no single thing that would bring sensuality, engaging with your senses, to diminish as proper attention, as perspective of attention, Yoniso Manasikara. And there is not a single thing that would make sensuality to increase as not having the perspective. Yoniso Manasikara.
So you can, being lustful towards a sensual image.
Perspective in regard to that would be, well, all the effort that you put in practicing the Dhamma that then has revealed the sense objects to be perilous, dangerous, resulting in death, suffering. So it's not something you always have to, I have to reattend now, it's perilous. No, it becomes part of the perspective if you've been doing it rightly. So every time you attend to sensuality, as the Buddha would say, the danger is apparent. So when perspective becomes apparent, means your Yoniso Manasikara has been properly fulfilled. You're gaining knowledge and wisdom.
You have the bigger picture.
So it takes effort to be focusing on the perspective, or to be discerning the perspective while the focus is taken by sensuality, by attention here and there. But if you invested enough of that peripheral effort, peripheral development, so to speak, then things become apparent. So now when I attend to sensuality, all I see is the danger. Now if I attend to non-sensuality, all I see is peace and pleasure, pleasure of renunciation. But that takes effort to develop.
But you have a perspective on what you are attracted to, which undermines that attraction, your craving. So if you're attracted to another body, a female body, by having perspective on what the body is.
Sure, the perspective on the nature of the body. And that's what I mean, you want to see it, those things, on the level of perspective. Not make another thing you're attending of. Because either way you're unaware of perspective. That's how people do the asubha wrongly. oh, I see beautiful, I must see ugly now, I must see ugly now. But that will work initially maybe when you kind of the reality, the surreal kind of aspect of ugly hits you, but you get used to it. It ceases to be surreal. Either way, you haven't developed perspective. So that's when in the Vinaya Pitaka, like all those rules that revolve around like basically people being attracted to becoming attracted to ugly and breaking rules and so on.
Right, exactly.
Because they haven't had perspective to begin with. So if you want to practice a Subha rightly, it's in regard to the beautiful, you want to see the perspective as revealing the ugly underneath. Not make another thing you look at and with your attention and stare at, because either way there will be no perspective.
Right. Because if you look in the world, there's people who are attracted to even the most disgusting things. Even excrement is attractive for them.
Yeah, no, there are.
That's
exactly, because there's no perspective.
Yeah.
So
no matter how...
whatever's in front of you has potential of becoming attractive because you haven't uprooted sensuality, craving for pleasure, and you are not developing perspective.
Right.
So just have it long enough, sufficiently enough, and you'll be attracted to it. But if you do have perspective, even the most beautiful and attractive things will actually be seen as ugly, because they are truly ugly and repulsive.
Mm-hmm.
If they weren't so, sensuality would not be unwholesome. Sensuality will not be a contradiction. It would not be pain. It would not be a cover-up. It will not be basically something you could get rid of.
So, when one attends with a perspective, unarisen taints arise.
Without a perspective.
When one attends without a perspective, unarisen taints arise and arisen taints increase. When one attends with a perspective, or one has perspective on one's attention, what one is attending to, unarisen taints do not arise, and arisen taints are abandoned. That's what you just said.
Yeah. I think what I was thinking of was, I think it was in Anguttara, some other sutta, but it says the same. It says the same.
Right.
Then that's the whole point. Like, you realize it's the fundamental. It's like right from the start, whether you're going to be going in the right direction or the wrong direction. With perspective is the right direction. Without perspective is the wrong direction. So if you start without a perspective on the right level, no amount of your practice then can sort of change the fact that you took the first step in the wrong direction, and now that's where you're heading. So that's where you'll be meditating with sensuality, not free from sensuality, not really getting any distinction of the kind that matters.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's why Yoniso Manasikara is one of the prerequisites for becoming a Sotapanna. So it's a necessary basis. If a Puthujjana would have, well, obviously, perspective is not a static thing. Some people have more, some people have less of it. Some people are wiser naturally, some people are not, because they, the life made them so, they made the effort, whatever. But fundamentally, you need more of a perspective. Doesn't matter how lofty, elevated Puthujjana you are or not, you need more perspective. Perspective on the certain universal truths, universal reality of things, which is what Dhamma is. So that means, in other words, some people have little dust in their eyes, some people have more dust in their eyes. Either way, there is dust in their eyes that needs to be removed.
You can't have too much.
You can't have too much of the right perspective. Exactly. Dhamma is actually uprooting all of your Puthujjana's perspectives. Because if they were not wrong, you would be free from suffering. You would not need to practice. So that's why, even as a prerequisite, Yoniso Manasikara needs to be developed. You don't have it. And that's why often, like, I find it quite unfortunate, it's often translated and watered down. Yoniso, it's a wise considering. It's appropriate attention. And so that's all stuff that Puthujjana can relate to, in a sense of, I wisely consider and appropriately sort of approach my sensuality. No, if you are able to approach sensuality, means there is no Yoniso Manasikara in you.
But the Yoniso is there.
Yoniso is there. So basically, then your idea of the right perspective is fully enveloped within the wrong perspective.
So actually, everyone has a perspective.
There's always some perspective, just whether it's going to be wrong or right, whether it's going to be limited or immeasurable. depending on, and certain direction, like a limited perspective cannot result in immeasurable perspective. But if you were to start developing the direction of immeasurable perspective, that can result in such perspectives. But that perspective takes cultivation and development. Doesn't happen to you, cannot happen to you. It's something you discern on account of basically being instructed. So Yoniso Manasikara and the right instruction are the necessary two prerequisites for arising of the right view. So you need the right instruction, but you also need to have the right perspective. So Putujana can engage in right perspective. He can start doing it, so to speak. And with the right instruction, he'll cease to be a Putujana. So right perspective is what this described before, looking at the universal characteristics of your current experience and not letting yourself be pulled or absorbed into the particulars of your observations, attention, techniques, sense objects, and so on. That's the beginning of that's at least the direction where you will develop the right perspective. So obviously the right perspective of Anagami, Yoniso Manasikara of Anagami, is far superior to the possibility of Yoniso Manasikara of Putujana, but it's the same direction. So if Putujana starts developing it, he will free himself from sensuality, for example. So it's there, it's the crossroads. It's like left or right, so to speak. Or more accurately, it's more like the two planes. One is the horizontal plane of left, right, front and back, and Yoniso Manasikara is the perpendicular plane. They would basically be surmounting any direction you take with your attention. Perspective is there unchanged.
Right. Surmounts any.
Yeah. Pretty much like the nature of sati and mindfulness.
Yes.
Which is also why you can't have too much mindfulness.
Right, yes, pretty much.
It's the same thing.
So let's go to the next section. And it says, taints to be abandoned by seeing. It says here, Bhikkhu is an untaught ordinary person, a Putujana, who has no regard for the noble ones, and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, who has no regard for true men and is unskilled and undisciplined in the Dhamma, does not understand what things are fit for attention and what things are unfit for attention. Since that is so, he attends to things unfit for attention and does not attend to things fit for attention.
Yeah, so he doesn't understand what things, if attended to, will obscure the perspective, and what things, if attended to, will fortify the perspective.
Because he has no perspective.
Because he has no perspective, so it's a vicious circle. He's locked in. So that's why he needs to start restraining beforehand out of faith, even if he has no recognition of the value of sense restraint and celibacy and so on. He needs to start doing it because, see, at least he unknowingly he's not fueling the wrong perspective anymore. So there is a possibility that he's going to start seeing things in the right context.
And if he met the true men, as it says, the noble ones, they would tell him just that. They would tell him, well, you don't see things correctly, but do this.
Start restraining, yeah. So yeah, that is the parallel situation of Putujana, we said many times before. You don't know the escape, you don't see the truth, the right order, the right perspective, and because of that, the lack of perspective is getting worse.
You think you have the right perspective.
Yeah. So there has to be a perspective there, but it's just going to be wrong and more wrong.
Yeah. It says, what are things unfit for attention that he attends to? They are things such when he attends to them, the unarisen taint of sensual desire arises, and the arisen taint of sensual desire increases.
Oh, yeah.
And the taint of being and the taint of ignorance.
Yeah, we said that in other talks.
Yes, so
it connects the same when we spoke about the meditation and how basically most people's meditation revolves around saying Silabhata Paramasa, the virtue and duty, the fetter, the first fetter that impedes them. It's related exactly to that. So by not knowing, by not having perspective of what you need to do, what you need to attend to, you attend to right things wrongly, wrong things rightly, wrong things wrongly, but you can't attain to right things rightly, because you have no perspective on it. And then, and that's what happens when people without such perspective then take on the practice and so on. But practice is not, it's not instructing them and teaching them how to look, basically, and develop perspective in regard to what they're practicing. It's just making them go through the motions of their practice. Oh, keep the precepts, and then do this, and then do this, and then do this, and then here is your mantra, and then do this. And the more they do it, the further away from getting the direction of the right perspective they are. So you have to do something, and the Buddha says what you do. Sense restraint, virtue, well controlling your senses, and so on. So that's what you're doing. And yeah, that is a factor to begin with, even if somebody's doing it rightly. But now you're also instructed to look at it, to gain perspective in regard to what you're doing. Not just do this. Do this and then understand why you're doing what you're doing. So you can't stop doing it. So you can't stop keeping the precepts in order to understand why you're keeping the precepts. You have to keep keeping the precepts in order to be able to understand eventually the purpose of keeping the precepts. And then you won't be keeping them in that sense. You won't be having to attend to them and do them, because now you understood their place and their nature. And same, you wouldn't be then doing any more meditation methods and techniques, because that was done before with there was no perspective. You were hoping of going through the motions will somehow bestow the knowledge upon you, but now you realize, oh no, it's me gaining knowledge in regard to what I'm doing. In regard to keeping the precepts, in regard to sense restraint, yeah, in regard to sitting quietly, just keeping the gaze in front of myself, not being distracted. But I'm not doing it as a method or a technique that I will adhere to for 4 minutes 30 seconds. I'm doing it so I can understand like the perspective behind, the universal characteristics of that. Withdrawal, composure, mindfulness, all these things. And that's how understanding can arise. And that's how you would overcome the first factor of doing things on account of practice and not seeing how they would be supporting the practice. Having no direct knowledge of that. So you just take on faith that being restrained and so on will help my practice. You take on faith that if I keep trying to meditate, I will get the right meditation. But unless your meditation, your precepts and stuff are being reflected upon and you're trying to understand them as to why is this wholesome, why is this worthy of development, why is this, why would this result in freedom from suffering, you will never understand it. Because no amount of do this and keep this precept would result in Dhamma arising in you. That's why they said, the Arahants themselves said that when they were at the first council. Well, what should we recite first? The vinaya, the rules, or the sutta? Well, the sutta is the Dhamma, but then said, but there's no Dhamma without vinaya. There's no Dhamma without the rules. So, rules are not the Dhamma, but there is no Dhamma without the basis of rules. So let's recite the rules first. So they recited all the stories from the Vinaya Pitaka. And then went into Dhamma. So rules are not the Dhamma, but you wouldn't be able to have any Dhamma whatsoever if there are no rules established. And when I say rules, I mean virtue, precepts, and sense restraint. Because it's all about that.
Yeah. It's like a calming form.
Yeah, so it's like you could ask yourself, as somebody who wants to practice Dhamma and keeps a precept, you ask yourself, okay, so do I understand this relationship between Dhamma and the precepts? Or do I think that my keeping of the precepts equates practicing of the Dhamma? Because it doesn't actually. Keeping of the precepts is one thing, practicing the Dhamma is the other.
Yeah.
So, do I understand this? No, if you don't understand it, if you don't see clearly, you are taking the precepts, they are fettering you. And yeah, sila, bhata, paramasa, virtue, duty, the good things, the wholesome things are a fetter. Because you have no perspective. Yoniso. You're attending them without perspective. And even if for 100 years, so it's good in terms of making merit, being virtuous and sense restraint, but there will be no wisdom arising. So even if you for 100 years you just keep the rules, but never invest effort into developing that perpendicular direction of, what's the context of these rules? That I will not break, but let me understand this, the purpose. And when you do, then you don't need to hold it. The knowledge has taken place. And as we said, like a noble person who is free from that fetter of sila, bhata, paramasa, even if they would sometimes, due to circumstances, break the rules, all they would need to do is just recognize that, and immediately pretty much their practice would be restored when they see fault as fault, because they see fault as fault, they will understand it. While somebody who is not free from Sila Paramasa, when they break the rules, it's even worse, because they had no perspective even with the rules. So they can't just repair it with an insight back on, because they had no insight to begin with. So that's why you have to develop that attitude of seeing the danger in the slightest fault, because the slightest fault can undermine everything you build up that could have possibly helped you gain perspective on your own keeping the precepts, for example. And we spoke about it in other talks. Like, you realize in the beginning you keep the precepts. If you gain the perspective, it's not about me doing the precepts, it's simply me not doing anything against the precepts. So you don't need to keep the precepts, all you need to do is not break them. And then they're there, because that became your mode of behavior. That's why there were no rules in the beginning. That was obvious to people who understood the Dhamma. And that's why that when that monk asked the Buddha, there were too many, there were 100-something rules at the time. He said, there's too many for me to keep, I can't wrap my head around it. And he said, can you keep, 3? Don't do anything rooted in greed, aversion and distraction.
Yeah, or don't do anything unwholesome and cultivate the wholesome.
Don't do anything unwholesome,
So
cultivate unwholesome.
so to speak,
even rules. So even just 2 rules. So he knew, anything that I can recognize, because he had perspective, as unwholesome, I'll not do it. Even if there is no specific letter of the rule that bans you from doing it. You know that it's bad because it's rooted in greed, aversion, delusion, and you won't do it. And if that's your criteria, you can never break the rules. Because you can take it even on that fundamental level. So there is no rule against, talking to people. Something wholesome. But you recognize that your motivation for doing so is rooted in you want to be distracted or whatever. Entertained, lustful, for whatever reason you're engaging in that which is not unwholesome in its letter, but it's unwholesome, and you would have perspective on that, because your fundamental motivation is the fundamental perspective of your action. And that's what we said, every action is intention. It's rooted in your intention. That determines the action. Even if, publicly, from the third person point of view, it is nothing unwholesome. They're talking about books and suttas and Tipitaka, but he does that internally for unwholesome reasons, or for not so wholesome reasons. So if your criteria now, with your right perspective, is to never do things that are rooted in greed, aversion, distraction, you can never basically be unwholesome. You can never break the rules. Because you're not guided now by the letter of, but the rule says I can talk to people. Yeah, that doesn't matter. That's like a very base criteria for people that have no criteria at all. But you should strive higher than that. If you were to develop Yoniso Manasikara properly, you would have perspective that wholesome, unwholesome is determined by wholesome, unwholesome intention behind those actions, and that's the criteria you follow, even if there is no formulated rule against it. So that's, if you start practicing like that, there are no loopholes in Vinaya, because it's all either rooted in wholesome or unwholesome or neutral. So Yoniso Manasikara is pretty much the fundamental thread that can take you from Putujana state to being fully enlightened, if you cultivate it. And I think we mentioned it before, it's like becoming that concern for your own welfare, and then recognizing the necessity of accepting responsibility for your actions, for your senses, for your intentions, for everything. Because when you're responsible, or when you feel responsible, well, you cannot afford to lose perspective. Oh, this is really important. I will consider everything before I commit to it. Only when you're irresponsible, you just act out, even in mundane terms, even in colloquial sense. Irresponsible people are people that don't really consider things, they don't really have context, they don't have perspective, they just want this, don't want this, they just irresponsibly act and then pretend it never happened or whatever else. So accepting responsibility for your own situation, even things you're not in control of, so to speak, it's better, because it can then prompt you in the direction of developing right perspective and right context, which is pretty much beginning of Yoniso Manasikara. And then with the right instruction, you can get the right view on account of it. So, if you wonder how it would feel like to do that, well, ask yourself, even in mundane terms, is responsibility pleasant or unpleasant? Is responsibility burden or light-hearted joy? Oh no, it's going to be heavier in the beginning, more unpleasant, because most of the life is about avoiding responsibility and getting the pleasure that covers up any sense of burden. But if you realize that that's not optional and you start accepting that burden of responsibility as a putujana, that's the basically precursor to the Yoniso Manasikara. The mundane right view. Oh, there are the results of my action. There is given, there is weight, there is significance of things. I cannot just ignore. There is the fact that I don't know. That's also the truth for you to begin with. That I'm not liberated, I'm not free from suffering.
I don't have that wise perspective.
Exactly. So accepting the reality of your situation and responsibility for you being in it. Because you keep yourself in whatever perspective you are in, right or wrong. By cultivating wrong perspective, that's what's going to proliferate and diversify and become more. By abstaining from it and kind of going against the pull of the wrong perspective and trying to develop that perpendicular right perspective, that will be on you again. Through your own effort, you can. So, either way, you need to take responsibility.